Hi everyone, my name is Mike Daniwin, and today I am going to be your moderator for this debate. My other wonderful group mates are Danielle, Jamie, Heather, Caitlin, and we'll be doing a formal debate today. The roles of the group member we have are the pro stater will be Danielle, the con stater will be Caitlin, the pro prover will be Jamie, and the con prover will be Heather. The pro attacker will be Jamie, and the con attacker will be Heather. Now let's start the debate. In today's day and age, as more and more children are getting diagnosed with ASD due to better assessment tool, we are in need of early intensive intervention to help the child get a boost to keep up with their typical peers. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in 2012 surveillance year, 1 in 68 children was diagnosed with autism. In 2004, it was 1 in 110. And 2008, it was 1 in 88 children. So as more and more children are being diagnosed with autism on the autism spectrum, there is a desperate need for early intervention to help them fulfill any deficit they need, such as social skills and receptive skills, just to name a few. As more and more children are diagnosed with ASD, there is a growing need for more intervention, and one issue that is constantly in debate is whether or not intervention used to treat ASD needs to be evidence-based. As is not having evidence-based intervention an ethical issue. Evidence-based practice is a model for professional decision-making in which practitioner integrates the best available evidence and clients' value, context, and clients' expertise in order to provide service for their clients. As individual who works in the field of ABA, it is important that we comply with all compliance codes set forth in the professional and ethical code, compliance code for behavior analysis. Some intervention can be great at treating children with ASD that may not be evidence-based, and so it is becoming an ethical issue of should this evidence intervention be used if there is no evidence-based research to prove its effectiveness. Evidence-based practice are practices which are backed and supported by many high-quality researchers and set up to scientific scrutiny. In the field, there has been many controversy on whether or not evidence-based practice or intervention for clients. The clients. According to the National Standard Project Phase 2, there is currently 14 established evidence-based practices, 18 emerging level of evidence, and 13 unestablished intervention for children, adolescents, and young adults under the age of 22. There is intervention that works well with children with autism, but are not considered evidence-based. Some believe that the only way to ensure that effective intervention are used, there needs to be standards on ensuring only evidence-based intervention are in practice. But if an intervention is proven to be effective, but it lacks evidence-based research to back up its finding, is that going against the ethics code? To answer this question, we present to you today a debate on whether or not standardizing evidence-based treatment is an ethical issue, and is it really a necessity to use only evidence-based practice in our field? We will talk about the pros and cons of it financially, politically, and both the pros and cons of non-evidence-based and evidence-based intervention. We will also talk about the legality of non-evidence-based intervention. I will now turn it over to our first group mate, and that will be Danielle as the pro stater.
Evidence-based practices are defined as a program of instructional strategies or interventions for teaching programs that is rigorous evidence of efficacy and effectiveness that results in consistent positive individual outcomes when tested by randomized controlled studies or quasi-experimental designs. Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysis State 1.01, Reliance of Scientific Knowledge, states and requires that behavior analysis rely on professionally derived knowledge based on science and behavior analysts when making scientific or professional judgments in human service provisions, or when engaging in scholarly or professional endeavors. Standardization of testing could increase treatments being delivered with fidelity, as it would narrow down a broad selection of treatments and manuals that could be developed. Standardization of evidence-based practices would guide schools to adopt research treatments that are comprehensive and proven effective for students birth to 22 years old. Additionally, it provides the school with confidence that the treatment they have implemented in the educational setting is both reliable and beneficial to their students. Educational professionals would know that the treatment satisfies the requirements. Treatment and interventions produced positive outcomes, as well as they did not associate or produce an unfavorable, meaning that the treatment was not found to be ineffective or harmful to the individual during research. Availability of funding might be made accessible for schools if they adopt a particular treatment package, as they could be part of the Fidelity Study Group and or be able to write for a specific grant. Standardization of evidence-based practices would allow facilities and treatment centers with limited resources, by being able to select from a more narrow selection of research-based treatments with proven efficacy and effectiveness. Use of best available evidence that is close as possible and uses expertise from there. Due to lack of resources, clients should have the awareness of what treatments and research supports their effectiveness. Facilities and treatment centers with resources to seek other various treatment options, such as evidence-based practices, can be a starting point for treatment because they are proven to be effective. If a factor of treatment is not appropriate, then those selecting the treatment would know what to do and what they need not when selecting a treatment. Professionals are in control of choosing whether a research available is applicable to their individual client. Professionals can select from a variety of evidence-based practice treatments and packages that aligns with the client's needs. The National Standards Project identified 14 treatments in phase 2 of the project as established for individuals birth to 22 years of age. After the treatment, there's only one treatment that's been effective and established for individuals 22 years of age and above, and that's the behavioral interventions. The behavioral intervention category consists of applied behavior analytic interventions to increase adaptive behaviors and decrease challenging behaviors. After the treatment has been selected, it is the responsibility of the professional to continuously collect data to determine if the treatment is effective with their particular client. Studies provide the practitioner with the probability that an intervention will provide effective results. Additionally, using research that has shown to be effective and produce results in at least some cases is better than using a treatment that has not been proven effective at all. If a treatment has been implemented with fidelity and is not producing effective results or is causing harm to the individual, the professional must execute their knowledge and judgment and cease that particular treatment. The National Standards Project reports not all established evidence-based practices are expected to produce beneficial results for all individuals with ASD. If there is a lack of research studies applicable to the situation at hand, professionals can make decisions using caution and use enhanced monitoring techniques while evaluating outcomes. Next up is Caitlin.
So a lot of the information and points brought up in terms of cons to standardizing evidence-based practice were brought up by Mullen and Strainer and Slocum et al. And some of the cons that they listed were the fact that it could strip away the notion of individualization and appropriateness for each client if only effective treatments were allowed or funded by insurance. So in this sense, each child needs to have an individualized program that is tailored to them and their needs. And if you have to pick from this list that either insurance providers say they will only cover practices and therapies that come from this list, then you're not truly individualizing treatments to these clients. And this goes against the compliance code set by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. The compliance code is 4.03, Individualized Behavior Change Programs. So particularly for adults that are age 22 and older, as of right now, there's only one proven technology to be used, as Danielle stated, and that just doesn't make up for an entire therapy package and treatment package for individuals, and that doesn't lead for much way for each client's needs to be individualized if they have to use strictly the things on this list, which is only one therapy at the current time. Researchers also feel this could lead to an exhausted ABA field by all of the research resources only being done on certain standardized effective treatments and taking away the focus of new emerging techniques. So if all of the resources and funding are being funneled into expanding on and tweaking practices that have already been found effective, then it could take away the incentive of people trying to find new and emerging techniques. They're not going to put money into something that's not going to be funded by insurance if practitioners can't use this practice for however long until it meets the requirements to be deemed evidence-based practice. This could also lead to nihilicism, and researchers will feel there's no research that's good enough to be deemed evidence-based practice. They feel as though they all have to agree upon and feel that there's enough research to deem this as evidence-based practice. In that sense, it might get very strict and feel as though it's not good enough to say that, yes, this is evidence-based, this will work, this is effective. Additionally, using systematic reviews to create lists of evidence-based practice is at risk of leaving out important studies that may be excluded solely due to search criteria. So when the NSP was created, they used certain keywords in their search to find the studies, to find the research that they decided made up the evidence-based practice. And if they left out, if a study, there could be studies that are conducted that left out these specific keywords, but actually be valid and effective treatments. Additionally, published research rarely includes enough description for replication, which often leads to providers not implementing evidence-based practice correctly. So in research studies, they go over the methods, procedures, but it would have to be extremely, extremely detailed for researchers to read it and know exactly that they are replicating the study. And without fidelity, it's not truly, if you're not following the evidence-based practice, then you're not actually providing an evidence-based practice treatment if you're not conducting it the same way that the researchers did so. Evidence-based practice takes time to implement in the classroom, and so when training others, it will be time-consuming, in which many places may not have the time to properly train their staff. This is particularly important regarding schools, because teachers and special education teachers may be required to implement these evidence-based practices, and a lot of times this will take a lot of time and training, which unfortunately is not always feasible. And as Cook and Odom stated, due to a lack of training, only 60% of teachers who adopt the practice would implement it with fidelity. So even if they were to implement an evidence-based practice, only about 60% of the teachers that did so would be implementing with fidelity. Additionally, particularly for teachers, looking up the most recent literature regarding the client's needs may not be practical given time constraints. So one of the requirements for following an evidence-based practice is if you are treating a client or a student in this case, and their behavior has changed and you know that you need to change and move on to something else, you are supposed to then look up what is the most recent literature, what does it say I should do now? And in a classroom setting, this isn't really practical. A teacher may have multiple students and they won't have the 15 minutes to go to the computer and look something up and then read up on the most recent literature on how to handle this one student's needs when they have a whole class. Evidence-based practice can also create a cookbook practice in using evidence-based practice lens to practitioners not using their own reasoning and judgment, which goes against Compliance Code 1.01, reliance on scientific knowledge. So in this sense, the researchers feel as though instead of relying on the practitioner's experience and knowledge to say, okay, I see the data, I feel as though this is not working, but instead of using my own judgment, I'm going to look at this list of things that I'm allowed to go to. These are what I can choose from essentially to implement. And instead of choosing something that you may have used with clients in the past that has been effective, but now if it's required that it has to be evidence-based practice and that method is not on this list, then they can't use their reasoning and judgment to use that practice. I will now pass it over to our pro-prover, Jamie.
Thanks, Caitlin. So evidence-based practices are defined as instructional strategies, interventions, and/or teaching programs that have been shown through experimentation to result in consistent positive results. Evidence-based practices integrate the best available research with clinical expertise and preferences. Evidence-based practices were incorporated into the field of education in 2002 with the passing of the No Child Left Behind Act, which stresses the importance of instructors to use empirically validated research. And in 2009, the Council for Exceptional Children stated that special education teachers are required by professional standards to implement effective teaching strategies supported through evidence. So even though these both passed in the 2000s, it's important to note that special education has been conducting research for 25 plus years. It helps ensure that the field has a solid, empirically supported series of practices and assessments, behavior, and instruction for special education students. Standardization could lead to more purposeful and targeted research and evidence-based practices when they are established. EBPs advance the field and help ensure the perspective that the opinions of experts are just that, opinions, and that research-supported evidence should be the main focus. Clinical judgment can be misguided, and requiring practitioners to follow the best available evidence will lead to better results. It is important to note that evidence-based practices do not negate the use of the practitioner's judgment, but does require a standard, a baseline for practitioners to adhere to. In fact, Odom and colleagues in their 2010 study stated that it is imperative teachers collect data on the strategy and measure progress prior to choosing a strategy not supported by evidence. So they're saying that in some cases, if they have already chosen an evidence-based strategy and it's not working, as long as they've collected the data and they've shown that that's not working, then they can choose another strategy that may not be evidence-based. But what they do say is that it should never take precedence over choosing an evidence-based strategy if it hasn't been attempted yet. Moreover, practitioners that use established research can be more confident that there is a higher probability that an intervention will provide effective results because of their actual research to support those conclusions. Using studies that have shown success in certain cases over methods that have not shown any evidence of effectiveness is much more valuable and can save money and time for both the individual in need as well as the practitioner. In regards to being cookie cutter, treatment packages are useful. However, evidence-based practices do not prevent practitioners from using multiple interventions in tandem. One of the biggest issues that comes up is the lack of resources. Treatment for children with autism especially is very expensive. There are a lot of options out there for families to have to go through. Clients need to have an awareness of what treatments have research to support the effectiveness. Because treatment can be very expensive, many clients lack the resources to gain access to a variety of treatments. And it is therefore essential that we narrow down their focus into what has been shown to be the most beneficial for their money and for their child. We need to maximize the effectiveness. Using evidence-based practices allows clients to utilize those resources for treatments that have shown effectiveness rather than put their money into something that hasn't. An example would be hyperbaric chambers. You know, in my state of Alabama, we don't have insurance coverage for ABA. So there aren't any treatments really that are covered. So a client is going to have to decide what is the most effective for their child. And if they have different people telling them different things and there's no standard, then they're liable to choose what sounds the best. What if hyperbaric chambers cost less than ABA therapy, then they may put all of their resources into that basket. So knowing what evidence is supported through research, consistent positive results is more beneficial to those families. Additionally, more funding might be available for schools if they adopt a particular treatment package, because they could be a part of a fidelity study. They could be able to write for specific grants, write for the materials, which could support that school, support the treatment options, in essence, help the students more. Overall, standardizing evidence-based practices is extremely important because we need to have the best possible outcomes for these students. And research is going to be what shows us this option is the best for this particular child. I will now turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, Jamie. So to start off, the things that have been brought up are by the pro side is fidelity, funding, and insurance, and then also how this plays out within school-based settings, that it would be beneficial for school-based settings. One comment that had been made on the pro side was that clients, they lack an awareness of what's available to them. And, you know, that's where, according to the Code of Ethics, we need to go out and put footprints with pediatricians and help them understand what is already evidence-based and ensure that best of our capacity, especially in rural areas. You know, not so much do we need to address and do a herd standardization of treatments, but we should go out, like I said, and put a footprint with pediatricians and individuals who are seeing these, especially the younger children, firsthand. And first, to address fidelity, there was a study completed by Stommer and colleagues in 2015. They investigated how evidence-based practices are being, whether or not they're being implemented with fidelity in public school settings by special education teachers, not general ed. What they did is they completed the study following these teachers who went through extensive training. They went through coaching and they had to learn the techniques and implement them. And the study followed them for 2 years. What they did find that it is possible to train special education teachers who also should have a background knowledge of some behavior modifications or structured teaching to even begin with. But they found that they were failing. They did well with the discrete trial training, but they failed in implementation of naturalistic evidence-based practices such as pivotal response treatment. You know, that is because, once again, there is such a specific amount of training that you need to think on the fly about, what do I do here whenever little Johnny is, having a tantrum? How do I find the function of that behavior, or if it's something new? And that is something that is difficult to standardize. Or what do you do if you've attempted all these toy withholdings and he still hasn't generated a response? Standardization would be very difficult for naturalistic evidence-based practices. Now, Stommer also found in that same study that the teachers and the staff, the paraprofessionals were left out of the loop. Like, the paraprofessionals received the information third hand, essentially. And so the paraprofessionals are the individuals who spend all of their day with those children that are being targeted by these programs. And also, another flaw they found was that the evidence-based practices that have been considered established on the NSP2, they were derived within a clinical setting, a clinical design, and had never been. Now, there were great outcomes with these methods, but those outcomes were not within a school setting. And so what happens is they found that teachers would take these evidence-based practices, but they would modify them on their own, or they would also combine them with other methods that they had been trained in. Obviously, this is affecting fidelity. It can affect outcomes and just overall data tracking, any type of being able to assess that actual implementation. And then another flaw, which didn't have to do with the study, but another flaw of evidence-based practice training for teachers is that they attend a 2 to 3 day workshop, and they are expected to just go into the classroom the next week and implement those things. There's no training, coaching, nothing of that nature. And so what there has to be, if there were to be a standardization of evidence-based practices, there would have to be an instrument of assessment to ensure that the implementation is being done with fidelity. The funding availability. So funding availability, yes, if we do evidence-based practices, like No Child Left Behind opened up Pandora's box on schools being able to write for grants. We're using this, or we need this. And it was generating some money for some school districts when they would take on these specific practices. But what should also be mentioned to parallel with that is funding may or may not be available. Recent investigations that have been published by the Council for Exceptional Children, they found that sequestration has cut $600 million of federal funds that have been allotted for special education within districts. So the direct hit that had been found by the CEC was that parapros job hours are getting cut. Teachers' caseloads are forever increasing. Directors of special education programs are not able, because they're managing so many staff now, or they've cut down on the designees that are in the buildings to generate the paperwork, that they have no time to go in and even assess what's already being implemented. So to say that funding might increase, that you almost have to think that that might be private funding by maybe the people that had designed the programs that became standardized. So that remains questionable, especially considering that a $600 million cut had happened of federal funds. And then there's also state funding that had been cut in, for instance, Kansas, the state of Kansas. I know I have personal knowledge with that several people had lost their paraprofessional jobs. And so they knew students were going without these parapros. And then the third topic would be insurances. Caitlin had brought up a lot of good points about companies might only want to cover those standardized evidence-based practices, and that can be such a horrible hurdle for families to have to manage, especially if they happen to have a BCBA who's already working with them in the home or, you know, within that school district. And then all of a sudden they are slammed with doing only an evidence-based practice that's been standardized. There have been, you know, our community, especially with behavior analysts, we're no strangers to hearing about legal cases that have happened even just a few years back of trying to get insurance companies to pay and accept that these are of intervention for the students that, or for the clients, that they are almost medically necessary in order to stop self-injurious behavior. But once again, and Caitlin had, she targeted all of the things that would be going against the BACB Code of Ethics, and that would be your lack of being able to individualize in violation of the Code 2.09. But overall, the evidence-based practices take a significant amount of time to implement. You know, there's tons of data collection. There are, once the data is collected, then it needs to be analyzed by someone that can understand it. So there would be strong concerns about this, how this could happen within a school district or even a clinic setting if you have just behavior technicians who are not registered behavior technicians, and they're collecting this data. Well, then possibly they might, you know, be assigned to analyze it as well. It would just, there would have to be a form of measurement to make sure that everything's being done accurately. Evidence-based practices, they are, once again, I'll say it again, they're generally designed in clinics and non-public school settings. So, you know, to close it off, that is definitely a concern. If there was a standardization and schools accepted it, they would have to think about their ability to match those outcomes. So that wraps it up for my Comprover, and I'm going to turn it back over to my teammate, Jamie.
There is a consensus with our group that in order for evidence-based practices to be effective, they must be implemented correctly. The argument, however, should not be we can't use evidence-based practices because we can't effectively train the teachers. The argument should be rather, how can we train teachers to effectively ensure that they are using the most beneficial strategies when teaching students? It's essential to ensure that all members involved in evidence-based practices strategies be trained on the procedure. So just like Heather mentioned, if paraprofessionals aren't being trained, that's the problem. That's not an argument to not do evidence-based practices. That's an argument for how can we get funding, how can we get more resources in order to make sure that the students are getting the absolute best treatment possible. Teachers should be encouraged to attend workshops, review research, and if the research does not provide adequate enough directions, you know, go online, go to other resources to make sure that you're finding out what is the best options for students. That's I know that asks a lot, but this is what has been shown using research over and over again. These are the best methods to use for children with these special needs. Teachers need to feel supported. They need to have access to research, and they also need to be involved in the decisions regarding what evidence-based practices would be best for their students. Most teachers want the best for their for the children that they work with, and they have a unique awareness of being able to identify the specific individualized traits, goals, and needs for each of their students. By allowing teachers to be part of the research, they may be able, like I said earlier, to get funding for their school, to get grants, but they're also the ones that can help to match strategies to the individual needs of each student. There's not just one evidence-based practice, there's multiple that can be used. And so they're the ones that you want to go to discuss what would be best for the students. And that in itself may help to ensure that they are getting trained to do it correctly. again, back to funding. There have been court cases in the United States ruling in favor of ABA, such as McHenry versus Pacific Source in 2010, and more recently, Burge versus United States of America court cases and a couple of others. The ruling was that ABA was medically necessary, and thus ensuring that those in need would receive coverage based on the overwhelming evidence of its benefit. Therefore, standardizing treatments based on research can only benefit the field by providing more support for their efficacy. Like I said, in Alabama, we don't have insurance coverage for ABA, but the goal is to get it here. And what do they use? They use research. They, when you do court cases, when you go to legislators, you use the research that shows these are the best methods. These are what make the most progress in children with autism. Taking the time out to do the research will be less of a hindrance than just arbitrarily choosing a method that may not work and having to start over with something else. You want to start with what has been shown to work. And if you standardize evidence-based practices, they're going to be out there for people to find easier. Yes, it's hard to dig through all the research, but if you have your evidence-based practices standardized, and here is what they are, and you can go to the Council for Exceptional Children, you can pull them up, you can look them up. It's not that you have to go and dig through libraries of research, but you do have to be aware of what an evidence-based practice is and what has been shown to be most effective to treat these certain symptoms. The guidelines of evidence-based practices are the best available evidence. Thus, trials with limitations are better than no evidence at all. And that will turn me back over to Heather.
Thank you, Jamie. So just a final closing on, being the con attacker in this position. I want to do a screen share of what had been found on the NSP2. So Danielle had already pulled this up. This is just, this goes both ways. It can be a con side to it, and it could be a pro side. Hey, there's one intervention out there for adults 22 and over. This is, this can be a big negative impact for if there were standardized evidence-based practices, simply because I could totally imagine that in an adult treatment center that they heavily rely on some of the newer methods that are being generated, simply because there hasn't been a whole lot of funding up until the year, I believe it was the year 2000, that some of the funding had been released, or that due to new governmental funding, the evidence-based practices are now being evaluated, but there's little documentation on the outcomes and the efficacy of it. And this was information that I had found on the ASAN website, actually. But again, there's a strong need for some of these newer practices for the adult community. You can see down here the unestablished interventions for adults, which sensory, I apologize for that. Sensory integration package, music therapy, modeling, which video modeling works well. They use a lot of modeling in how they go out and get jobs.
Sure, Heather.
Is it working?
We see you, not your visual.
Oh, no. Let me see. Now. Hopefully that's working now.
Yep, go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, so to back up what I just said, apologize for that, everyone. But again, you see down here modeling, and there's CBI on there as well. But these things are important for them to go out and seek jobs. To go back up to here what they have as the established for under age of 22, or I'm sorry, the emerging. What should be, it should be a little bit shocking that the picture exchange communication system is listed here. That's been around since the 60s. There was comments by Odom et al. In 2009 that the reason that a lot of these practices that had been around for a number of years were because there was lack of employing randomized clinical trial methods in their research. And so unfortunately, they wound up on the emerging and non-established for the NSP2. And so, you know, once again, it's, and then also down on the actual unestablished, you'll find, I believe it's the theory of mind is on here. If it's, and then floor time, DIR, of course, sensory integration therapy. We all know that this is, it's beneficial. I'm sorry, theory of mind is under emerging, but sensory integration therapy can be beneficial to decrease self-stimulatory behaviors and increase their ability to actually sit for instruction and get those academic skills. Now, to summarize on this, the reason I showed this is because it's important to reflect on the fact that one of the major studies that had been completed showed very few established. And I think it had a lot to, you know, I agree with the article that I'd read from Odom et al. In 2009, that it has to do with the fact that their research was not randomized clinical trial. You know, because they didn't have that methodology, as Caitlin had said, it went off of trigger words when they searched for these, and hence it didn't get a huge umbrella of that were evaluated by that metric scale. But at this point, I'll close and I can pass it back to our pro stater, Danielle.
Okay, just to summarize what some of the group members have already said, evidence-based practices have been found to be the best practices to use for individuals with autism. They have proven effectiveness and efficacy if implemented properly. The field of behavior analysis requires that through Professional and Ethical Compliance Code 1.01, that behavior analysts rely on information derived from research and science that has been proven to be effective with individuals with ASD. Also, Code 1.03, maintaining competence through professional development, requires that as a behavior analyst that we continue to seek out knowledge and continuously take classes or workshops to continue growing within our field and learning new ways in which we could help individuals. Also, Compliance Code 2.09 requires that clients have a right to effective treatment based on research and literature. So again, we must implement evidence-based practices that will help the individual meet their needs. Also, Dr. Candace Baker at Texas A&M, who is in the direction of autism, of the Autism Intervention Center, in order to develop appropriate preparation models for teachers who will teach students with ASD, it is imperative that preparation programs infuse evidence-based practices into coursework. Yet, there needs to be an agreement among experts concerning the different skill sets needed by general education teachers, special education teachers who provide inclusive supports, and special education, special education teachers who provide inclusive supports, and special education teachers who provide full instructional programs and related service providers. After experts are able to determine the need, 3-tiered skill sets for teachers who provide different levels of intensive instruction, then perhaps a standardization of programs across institutions may be feasible. Next up is Caitlin, the constater.
Okay, so to summarize what Heather and I have been saying, yes, evidence-based practice has a lot of great merits, and it is definitely necessary as practitioners and following the compliance codes. You want to be using methods that are effective, and you want to be going to those first with your clients. However, standardizing would mean that providers have to go to a list that is deemed evidence-based practice and prove that it is not effective for their client before they can move on to something off of the emerging list, for instance. So this would be particularly difficult for adults age 22 and older, because right now there's only one thing listed as evidence-based practice. And knowing, this would not be the way to go for my client, using their scientific knowledge on the code 1.01, reliance on their scientific knowledge as a practitioner, knowing that that would not work for them. But if there were standardized evidence-based practice, they would have to go through the intervention, prove that it was not effective, and then move on. So this is a waste of time, resources, and it's not what's best for the client. Additionally, researchers have said that for standardization to be truly helpful and effective, there would need to be treatment packages created. So these studies have proved that this is an effective treatment. Now you can use these things in conjunction. It helps, especially if it's going to be implemented in the schools, that these things work together. You can use this as a treatment package. For those to be created would take a lot of time and resources, and in doing so could really pull from the research pool and people working towards new techniques. So it could really kind of put the field at a standstill and a halt, because everyone would be kind of tweaking and trying to fix the treatment, create treatment packages for a standardization of evidence-based practice. And it could be years before anyone would move on to trying to find new and emerging packages. So with that, I will pass it over to Mike, who will close our debate.
Hi, thank you, Caitlin. So we heard a lot of very useful, informative information about both the pros and cons of evidence-based practice and non-evidence-based practice, the political, the financial standpoint of both of the practices. We will let you decide. Let you guys decide what you guys think. Thank you.